The letter arrived on October the 16th, 1888. George Lusk held it in his trembling hands, the envelope still damp from the morning fog that had crept through Whitechapel's narrow lanes. The handwriting was crude, almost childlike, yet deliberate. Inside, folded twice, was a brief message written in red ink, or what he prayed was ink. But it was the small cardboard box that accompanied the letter that made his breath catch in his throat. He set the envelope aside and lifted the lid with careful fingers. The smell reached him first, metallic, organic, wrong. Wrapped in tissue paper, preserved in spirits, was a piece of human kidney, half of it. The letter claimed the other half had been fried and eaten. The room seemed to tilt. Outside, the streets of Whitechapel moved on, unaware. Children played near the 10 bells. Women haggled over fish at the market. Chapter 1. The Vigilance Committee. Good evening, and welcome to the Bedside Historian. The night is quiet now, and the world has grown small around you. Wherever you are listening from, whatever hour marks your clock, let us drift backward together through time. Tonight, we return to the autumn of 1888, to the narrow streets of Whitechapel, to the gaslit fog and the cobblestones slick with rain, to a place where terror walked freely and ordinary men tried to stand against it. Before we begin, if you find comfort in these whispered histories, please subscribe to this channel. Now, let the present fade. Let us descend into the past. The summer of 1888 had been unremarkable in Whitechapel. The district, pressed against the eastern edge of London like a bruise against pale skin, carried on as it always had. The lodging houses filled each night with those who could afford fourpence for a bed. The public houses emptied their barrels and filled their tills. The markets opened before dawn, selling wilted vegetables and day-old bread to women in shawls who counted their pennies twice. Children played in the courts and alleys, their laughter rising above the clatter of cartwheels and the calls of street vendors. It was a place of poverty, certainly, but also of routine. Life moved forward in its grinding, predictable way. George Lusk was a builder by trade. He was 53 years old that autumn, a man of moderate means who had lived in Whitechapel long enough to know its rhythms. His business was respectable, his reputation solid. He was not wealthy, but neither was he desperate. He lived with his family in Alderney Road, a narrow street that ran between the commercial road and the docks. His days were spent measuring timber and calculating costs, his evenings at home or occasionally at the public house with men he had known for decades. He was not a man who sought attention or adventure. He was not a man who imagined himself standing at the centre of history's darkest mystery. August ended quietly. September arrived with cooler air and the first hints of autumn's decay. The market smelled of overripe fruit. The mornings required a coat. And on the last day of August, just after midnight had passed into the 31st, a woman named Mary Ann Nichols was found in Buck's Row with her throat cut so deeply that her head was nearly severed from her body. Her abdomen had been opened, her intestines exposed. The police came, the body was removed. The street was washed clean by morning. Whitechapel had seen murder before. Violence was not uncommon in a district where gin was cheap and desperation constant. Women who sold themselves on the streets often met brutal ends. The police investigated with the resources they had, which were few, and the interest they could muster, which was less. But Mary Ann Nichols was only the beginning. 8 days later, on September 8th, Annie Chapman was found in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street. Her throat had been cut, her abdomen opened and emptied, her intestines had been placed over her shoulder. Certain organs had been removed with what the police surgeon described as anatomical knowledge. The city began to pay attention. 2 murders in 8 days, both women of the same class, both killed in the same manner, both mutilated after death. The newspapers seized upon the story with the hunger of creatures that had found fresh meat. The Whitechapel murderer, they called him, leather apron, the terror of the East End. Descriptions varied. Witnesses contradicted one another. The police pursued leads that dissolved like morning mist. And the women of Whitechapel, those who had no choice but to walk the streets after dark, began to move in pairs, to glance over their shoulders, to feel the weight of eyes they could not see. George Lusk read the newspapers like everyone else. He discussed the murders with his fellow tradesmen over pints of ale. He agreed that something must be done, that the police seemed ineffective, that the women deserved protection. But he did not imagine, not yet, that he would be the one to act. That impulse came from the community itself, from the shopkeepers and labourers and small businessmen who watched their neighbourhood become a hunting ground and decided they would not simply wait for the next body to appear. The idea formed gradually, in conversations at public houses and on street corners. A citizens' patrol, a volunteer force to walk the streets at night, to escort women home, to watch the dark places where a killer might hide. The police had failed. The government had done nothing. The people of Whitechapel would have to protect themselves. Meetings were held, names were put forward, and George Lusk, respected and steady, found himself elected chairman of what they called the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee. He accepted the position with reluctance and duty in equal measure. This was his neighbourhood. These were his people. If the authorities would not act decisively, then ordinary citizens must. The committee formed officially in late September. 16 men at first, though the number would grow. They organised patrols, 2 men to a route, walking the streets between midnight and dawn. They carried lanterns and sticks. They challenged strangers and noted suspicious behaviour. They were not trained investigators or professional watchmen. They were builders and shopkeepers and market workers trying to impose order on chaos through sheer presence and will. The committee needed funds. Patrols cost money, oil for lanterns, payment for those who gave up work to walk the night streets, printing costs for circulars and notices. George Lusk wrote letters to newspapers. He appealed to merchants and politicians. He stood in his modest office on Alderney Road and composed requests for donations with the same careful precision he brought to measuring timber. Some funds arrived. Not enough, never enough, but sufficient to continue. The patrols walked. The streets remained dangerous, but at least someone was watching. On September the 27th, the Central News Agency received a letter. It was written in red ink, signed with a name that would become legend, Jack the Ripper. The letter mocked the police, promised more murders, and was dismissed by many as a hoax. London received dozens of such letters, cranks and attention-seekers drawn to horror like moths to flame. But this one was different. The handwriting was distinctive, the tone was playful and cruel, and when the next murders came, the details matched what the letter had promised. September became October. The air grew colder. The fog thickened in the early mornings, turning the gas lamps into dim halos of yellow light. The city waited. The Vigilance Committee continued its patrols, and George Lusk continued his work as chairman, organising routes and coordinating with police who viewed the volunteers with a mixture of gratitude and irritation. He was a visible figure now, his name appearing in newspaper accounts of the committee's activities. He was no longer anonymous, no longer simply a builder living quietly in Whitechapel. He had stepped forward. He had made himself known, and someone had noticed. On the night of September 30th, 2 women were murdered within an hour of each other. Elizabeth Stride was found in Dutfield's yard, her throat cut but her body otherwise untouched. The killer had been interrupted. Catherine Eddowes was discovered in Mitre Square, mutilated beyond recognition, her face slashed, her abdomen opened, her organs removed. The double event, as it came to be called, sent panic through the district like a physical force. The killer was accelerating. He was bold enough to kill twice in one night, close enough to police patrols that he could hear their footsteps as he worked. The Vigilance Committee increased its efforts. More men joined the patrols, more streets were covered. George Lusk worked late into each night, coordinating volunteers, responding to correspondence, meeting with police officials who promised action but delivered little. He was exhausted, but he could not stop. Every night that passed without a body felt like a small victory. Every morning that dawned over Whitechapel without screams or the sight of police wagons felt like grace, borrowed against an unpayable debt. He did not know, as October's second week began, that the killer had already chosen him. That among all the men and women in Whitechapel, all the police and politicians and journalists, George Lusk had been selected for something that would mark him forever. The letter was already written, the package was already prepared, and in some dark room in some unknown corner of the city, a man who had killed at least 5 women was wrapping half a human kidney in tissue paper and placing it in a small cardboard box. The morning of October the 16th arrived cold and grey. George Lusk woke in his home on Alderney Road, dressed, ate breakfast with his family, and prepared for another day of building work and committee business. The post arrived as it always did. Among the usual letters and notices was an envelope addressed to him in crude handwriting. He set it aside, intending to open it later. He did not know what it contained. He did not know that his ordinary life had just ended, and something else, something darker and stranger, had begun. The city moved around him, unaware. Somewhere a killer smiled, but George Lusk, chairman of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, sat alone in his small parlour, staring at the severed organ before him, and understood with cold certainty that he had been chosen, not as a victim, but as a witness. The Ripper had written to him, and now the shadow of that autumn would follow him the rest of his days. Chapter 2. The Autumn of Blood. The first victim had been 43 years old. Mary Ann Nichols, known as Polly to those who shared her lodging houses and her circumstances, had walked the streets of Whitechapel for years. She had been married once, had borne 5 children, had worked in domestic service before drink and poverty pulled her down into the netherworld of the East End's poorest districts. On the night of August 31st, she had been turned away from her lodging house for lack of the 4pence needed for a bed. She had laughed about it, told the deputy she would soon have the money, gestured at her new bonnet as proof of her prospects. She walked into the darkness of Bucks Row some time after 2 in the morning. By 3:40 she was dead on the cobblestones, her bonnet beside her, her skirts raised, her throat cut with such violence that the vertebrae were visible. The police came. Constable John Neal had found her on his beat. His lantern, revealing what at first appeared to be a bundle of rags against a stable door. The doctor was summoned. Dr. Rhys Llewellyn arrived and pronounced her dead, noting the throat wounds first, then discovering as dawn light strengthened that her abdomen had been opened with a long, deep cut. The body was removed to the mortuary. The street was examined. No weapon was found. No witnesses came forward. The investigation began with the assumption that this was another East End murder. Brutal but not unprecedented. Likely the work of a husband or client gone mad with drink or rage. But the cutting troubled the police surgeon. The abdomen wound was not random. It was deliberate, though not surgical. Someone had opened her with purpose, though what that purpose was remained unclear. The newspapers reported the murder with moderate interest. A woman of unfortunate circumstances killed in Whitechapel. The city had seen worse. The city had seen it many times before. 8 days later, Annie Chapman left her lodging house at 35 Dorset Street. She too lacked the money for a bed. She too promised to return with payment. She was 47 years old, chronically ill, supporting herself through needlework and prostitution in equal measure. She had been married to a coachman who drank himself to death. She had lost 2 children to illness. She moved through the world with the resigned dignity of someone who had stopped expecting mercy from life. At 5:30 in the morning of September 8th, a resident of 29 Hanbury Street discovered her body in the narrow backyard behind the building. She lay on her back near the steps. Her throat had been cut from left to right, severing everything down to the spinal column. Her abdomen had been opened entirely. Her intestines had been lifted out and placed over her left shoulder. Her uterus and part of her bladder had been removed and taken away. The police surgeon, Dr. George Bagster Phillips, examined the body where it lay. His report would note the precision of certain cuts, the evident anatomical knowledge demonstrated by the removal of specific organs, the likelihood that the killer had some medical or butchering experience. The murder had occurred in a yard accessible from the street in the early morning when people were waking and moving about their business. Yet no one had heard a sound beyond what might have been a brief cry that could have been anything in a district where noise was constant. The killer had worked quickly, efficiently, and vanished into the maze of courts and alleys that made Whitechapel a hunter's paradise. Now the newspapers paid full attention. 2 women, similar circumstances, similar mutilations. A pattern was emerging. The term Whitechapel murderer appeared in headlines. Speculation flourished. Was the killer a doctor, a butcher, a madman from the slums, or a gentleman from the West End seeking perverse thrills? The police interviewed witnesses who contradicted each other. A man in a dark coat, a man in a light coat, a man with a foreign accent, a man who looked respectable. Every description was different. Every lead dissolved. The women of Whitechapel, those who had no choice but to continue their trade, grew cautious but not cautious enough. Poverty does not permit the luxury of fear. They walked in pairs when possible, refused clients who seemed strange, but still they walked. The lodging houses still demanded their 4p. The landlords still expected their rent. Survival meant risk, and so they took it, night after night, hoping the killer would choose someone else, hoping the police would make an arrest, hoping that luck and providence would carry them through to morning. September wore on. The police increased patrols, the newspapers printed theories and accusations. The Vigilance Committee formed, and George Lusk took his position as chairman. The streets were watched, but the killer knew them better than any patrol. He knew which alleys led where, which courts had multiple exits, which shadows were deep enough to conceal a man and his terrible work. On the night of September 30th, the killer struck twice. Elizabeth Stride was 44 years old. She had been born in Sweden and had come to England decades earlier, had married and been widowed. She supported herself through sewing and occasional prostitution, lived in a lodging house on Flower and Dean Street, and was known to those who knew her as Long Liz. On that night she was seen multiple times in the company of a man, descriptions varying as always. At 1 o'clock in the morning she was found in Dutfield's yard off Burner Street, her throat cut deeply, blood still flowing from the wound. Her body was otherwise untouched. No mutilations, no opened abdomen. The theory formed immediately. The killer had been interrupted. Someone or something had disturbed him before he could complete his work. 45 minutes later, and less than a mile away, Catherine Eddowes was found in Mitre Square. She was 46 years old. She'd spent the early evening in the drunk tank at Bishopsgate Police Station, arrested for intoxication, released just after midnight when she was judged sober enough to walk. She gave a false name when released, as she often did. She walked into the night. By 1:45 she was dead in Mitre Square, discovered by a police constable on his regular beat. What had been done to her body was beyond what had been done to the others. Her throat was cut, her face was slashed repeatedly, the nose severed, the eyelids cut, her abdomen was opened entirely, the intestines pulled out and draped over her right shoulder. Her left kidney and her uterus had been removed and taken. A portion of her apron, cut from the garment she wore, was found later in Goulston Street, dropped or discarded, bearing a message written in chalk on the wall above it that the police photographed, then erased before dawn to prevent riots. 2 women dead in one night, 2 different locations, same hand. The city convulsed with fear and rage. How could this happen with increased patrols? How could a man kill twice, mutilate at leisure, and escape unseen? The police had no answers. The newspapers had no mercy. The East End seethed with suspicion and terror. Jewish residents faced accusations from those looking for someone to blame. The streets filled with anger and paranoia in equal measure. The double event, as the newspapers called it, marked a turning point. Before, there had been hope that the murders were random, that they might stop as suddenly as they began. After September 30th, that hope died. The killer was not finished. He was confident. He was mocking the authorities, and he was somewhere in the crowd looking like anyone, impossible to distinguish from the thousands of men who walked Whitechapel's streets every day. October arrived. The leaves turned brown and fell from the few trees that survived in the district. The fog grew thicker, rolling in from the Thames each evening, and settling over the streets like a burial shroud. The gas lamps burned dimly through the haze. The patrols continued. George Lusk organised his volunteers, walked his own routes, and wrote his letters seeking funds and support. The police followed their leads to nowhere. The newspapers printed their theories and their accusations, and the women of Whitechapel, having no other choice, continued to walk the streets after dark, their eyes searching the shadows, their ears alert for footsteps behind them. The city held its breath and waited for the next murder. The killer, patient and invisible, prepared his next communication. Not another body this time. Something different, something personal. A message for the man who dared to stand against him, the chairman of the Vigilance Committee, the builder from Alderney Road who thought ordinary citizens could stop what the police could not. The package was being prepared. The letter was being written. And George Lusk, walking his nightly patrol through streets thick with fog, had no idea that he had already been chosen. Chapter 3. The letters begin. The first letter arrived at the Central News Agency on September 27, 1888. The agency, located in the City of London, served as a clearinghouse for news distributed to newspapers throughout England and beyond. Letters arrived there constantly, tips and complaints and desperate pleas for attention from every variety of crank and legitimate source. The staff sorted through them with practiced efficiency, discarding most, forwarding some to the appropriate authorities or publications. The letter that arrived that Thursday was written in red ink on cheap paper. The handwriting was distinctive, flowing and confident, with unusual letter formations that suggested either deliberate disguise or genuine peculiarity. The letter began without preamble. It addressed Dear Boss with casual familiarity, then proceeded to mock the police for their inability to catch the writer. It claimed credit for the Whitechapel murders, described them with evident pleasure, and promised more to come. It complained that previous victims had not screamed properly, expressed eagerness to continue the work, and introduced a name that would outlive everyone who read it. The signature was written with flourish, Jack the Ripper. Below that, a postscript apologized for the messy handwriting, explaining that the writer had been interrupted while composing the letter. The tone throughout was playful, almost jovial, as though the writer were discussing a sport rather than murder. The agency staff read it, discussed it, and filed it with the other crank correspondents. London received dozens of such letters whenever a sensational crime captured public attention. Most were obvious fabrications written by disturbed individuals seeking importance or notoriety. This one seemed no different. It was placed in a drawer and forgotten. 3 days later, Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes were murdered. On October 1st, the Central News Agency received a second communication. This one was a postcard written in the same red ink, the same distinctive hand, some referenced the double event before the newspapers had fully reported it, used language that suggested genuine knowledge of the crimes, and was signed again Jack the Ripper. The postcard mentioned that the writer had not had time to remove the ears from one victim, a detail that seemed to reference Catherine Eddowes, whose ear had been partially severed. Now the agency took notice. The timing was impossible to ignore. The postcard had been postmarked before the full details of the double murders were publicly known. Someone with genuine knowledge or an extraordinary coincidence had written it. The agency forwarded both the letter and postcard to Scotland Yard. The police examined them, debated their authenticity, and ultimately made them public. Facsimiles were printed in newspapers. The name Jack the Ripper entered the public consciousness and lodged there permanently. The flood began immediately. Letters arrived at police stations, newspaper offices, politicians' homes, and the Central News Agency by the dozen, then by the score, then by the hundreds. Most were obvious hoaxes. Some were disturbing in their detailed knowledge of murder techniques. Others were barely literate ravings. A few demonstrated such specific knowledge of the crimes that police had to investigate them seriously. The handwriting varied wildly. The postmarks came from across London and beyond. Distinguishing the genuine from the false became impossible. Every letter demanded attention. None provided answers. George Lusk, as chairman of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, received his share of correspondence. Most were letters of support, donations, or suggestions for how the committee might better organise its patrols. Some were criticisms, accusations that the committee was interfering with police work or wasting resources on futile gestures. A few were threatening, warning Lusk to cease his activities or face consequences. He read them all with the same steady patience he brought to everything, filing away what was useful, discarding what was not, and continuing his work regardless. The newspapers published extensive coverage of the letters phenomenon. Experts were consulted. Handwriting analysts offered opinions. Theories multiplied. Was the killer educated or illiterate? Did the red ink signify blood or merely dramatic flair? Was the American spelling of certain words genuine or affected? Every detail was examined, debated, and used to support contradictory conclusions. The East End versus West End theory gained traction. Was the killer a slum dweller who knew the streets intimately, or a gentleman slumming for perverse entertainment? Both theories had their adherents. Neither had proof. The police, overwhelmed by the volume of correspondence and the demands of the investigation, struggled to maintain order in their own ranks. Detective Inspector Frederick Aberlin led the Whitechapel investigation with dedication but limited resources. The Metropolitan Police and the City of London Police operated in overlapping jurisdictions with imperfect cooperation. Scotland Yard received political pressure from above and public criticism from below. Every lead had to be followed. Every letter had to be logged. Every witness statement had to be recorded and checked against others. The bureaucratic machinery of Victorian law enforcement ground forward, meticulous but slow, while the killer moved fast and invisible. Among all these letters, one would prove different. One would contain not just words but evidence. One would arrive not at a police station or newspaper office, but at the home of George Lusk, the builder from Alderney Road, the chairman who had dared to organise citizens against the terror. That letter was being prepared as October's second week began. The handwriting would be cruder than the Dear Boss letter, the language more direct, the tone less playful, and it would arrive with a package that would make George Lusk's name inseparable from the Ripper mystery forever. But before that letter came, the city lived with the others. They papered the walls of police stations. They filled newspaper columns. They provided endless material for speculation and theory. Some were signed Jack the Ripper. Others used different names: Leather Apron, the Whitechapel Murderer, Jack the Knife. Some claimed credit for all the murders, others for only specific victims. Some promised future killings and provided dates and locations. When those dates passed without incident, new letters arrived explaining the delay or changing the prediction. The psychological effect on Whitechapel was profound. The letters made the killer seem omnipresent, supernatural, capable of seeing and knowing everything. He was not just a man who killed in darkness and fled. He was a presence that communicated, that watched, that played games with authorities. The fear that had gripped the district after the murders intensified into something closer to hysteria. Women refused to leave their lodgings after dark unless absolutely necessary. Men organised into informal groups, armed with clubs and knives, ready to attack anyone who seemed suspicious. The police received dozens of reports of suspected rippers, most entirely innocent men who had the misfortune to look foreign or dress strangely or walk alone at night. George Lusk read the newspaper accounts of the letters with the same attention he gave everything else related to the murders. He understood their power, their ability to generate fear beyond even the physical crimes themselves. Words had weight, threats had impact. A killer who could write, who could mock and promise and play, was somehow more terrifying than one who simply acted. It suggested intelligence, planning, awareness. It suggested that the murders were not the product of blind rage or madness, but of someone who enjoyed his work and wanted the world to know it. He did not imagine, reading those accounts, that he would soon receive his own communication. That among all the people in London, he had been selected as worthy of the killer's attention. The Vigilance Committee had made him visible. The newspapers had printed his name. And somewhere in the city, In some room no one had yet discovered, a man was writing George Lusk's name on an envelope in crude handwriting, preparing a message that would be remembered long after every other letter had been forgotten. The package was wrapped, the letter was sealed, and in the ordinary course of London's vast postal system, it began its journey toward Alderney Road, carried by the men who had no idea what they transported, moving through the streets with the same efficiency that delivered love letters and business correspondence and bills of sale. Just another piece of mail in a city that sent millions. Just another envelope among thousands, but this one carried half a human kidney. And when George Lusk opened it, history would open with it. Chapter 4. From Hell. The morning of October the 16th began like any other. George Lusk woke in his home on Alderney Road as dawn broke grey and cold over Whitechapel. His wife moved about the house preparing breakfast. The sounds of the city waking rose outside, cartwheels on cobblestones, vendors calling their wares, the distant whistle of ships on the Thames. He dressed in his work clothes, ate bread and tea, and reviewed in his mind the tasks that waited. Building estimates to complete, timber to order, and in the evening another Vigilance Committee meeting to organise the night's patrols. The post arrived mid-morning. The postman made his rounds through the streets of East London carrying letters and parcels, bills and notices, the endless paper flow that connected the Empire's capital to itself and the world beyond. He knocked at the door of the Lusk home and handed over the day's delivery. Among the usual correspondence was a small package, wrapped in brown paper, and an envelope addressed in handwriting that was barely literate. The letters formed with obvious difficulty, as though by someone unaccustomed to writing or deliberately disguising their hand. George Lusk set the package aside and opened his other mail first. Business correspondence, a letter from a supplier, a note from another Vigilance Committee member. The ordinary machinery of daily life. Then he turned to the package. It was light, smaller than a book, wrapped simply, no return address. He untied the string and folded back the paper. Inside was a small cardboard box, the kind that might hold jewellery or small household items. He lifted the lid. The smell reached him immediately. Organic, wrong, something preserved but decaying. He looked inside and saw tissue paper stained dark. He lifted the paper with careful fingers and stopped breathing. Lying in the bottom of the box, suspended in what appeared to be spirits or wine, was a piece of human flesh, roughly 3 inches long, dark red, unmistakably organic, unmistakably real, a portion of what he recognised with sick certainty as a kidney. He set the box down with trembling hands. The room seemed to tilt, his vision narrowed. He had seen death before, had attended funerals, had walked past the spots where the Ripper's victims had fallen. But this was different. This was not death at a remove. This was death delivered to his door, held in his hands, sitting in a box on his table while morning light streamed through the window and the sounds of normal life continued outside. He remembered the envelope. He opened it with fingers that would not stay steady. The letter inside was written on a single sheet of paper in the same crude handwriting as the address. No salutation, no preamble, just words that struck like blows. From hell, Mr. Lusk. Sir, I send you half the kidney I took from one woman, preserved it for you to the piece. I fried and ate it was very nice. I may send you the bloody neff that took it out if you only wot a while longer, signed. Catch me when you can, Mr. Lusk. He read it twice, 3 times. The misspellings, the casual tone, the claim about frying and eating part of the organ. The signature that was no signature at all, just a taunt. His mind worked to process what his eyes were showing him. Someone had sent him part of a human kidney. Someone was claiming to be the Whitechapel murderer. Someone knew his name, knew his address, knew he was chairman of the Vigilance Committee, and had chosen him specifically for this grotesque communication. The box sat on the table. The letter lay beside it. Outside, a cart rattled past. A child called to another in the street. The world continued its ordinary rotation, while George Lusk sat in his parlour holding a proof that the devil walked among them and knew his name. His first thought was that it must be a hoax. Some cruel person had obtained animal organs from a butcher and sent them to torment him. The Vigilance Committee had made him prominent. His name appeared in newspapers. Any madman with a taste for spectacle could have done this. But the smell, the appearance, the way the tissue looked unmistakably human, and the letter's reference to taking it from one woman. Catherine Eddowes had been murdered 16 days earlier. Her left kidney had been removed. The post-mortem examination had confirmed it. The detail was not public knowledge, but neither was it completely secret. Doctors knew. Police knew. Newspaper reporters with the right connections might have learned. He could not decide alone. He wrapped the kidney back in its paper, placed it in the box, closed the lid. He folded the letter carefully. Then he stood, put on his coat and left the house. He needed to show this to someone else. Needed confirmation that what he held was real and not some nightmare his mind had constructed. He went first to the committee's unofficial headquarters, a small office where they kept records and coordinated patrols. Other members were there. He showed them the package without explanation. Their reactions confirmed his own. This was not animal flesh. This was human. This was real. The police had to be informed. George Lusk took the package and letter to Leman Street Police Station, the nearest Metropolitan Police facility. He was shown to an office where he explained what he had received. The officers examined the contents with professional detachment that barely concealed their shock. They took notes. They asked questions. Where exactly had it arrived? What time? Had anyone else touched it? Had George Lusk received any other suspicious correspondence? They treated him with a mixture of concern and suspicion, as though receiving such a package made him complicit somehow, or at least contaminated by proximity to horror. The package was sent for medical examination. Dr. Thomas Horrocks Openshaw, curator of the Pathology Museum at the London Hospital, was asked to examine the organ and provide his professional opinion on its nature and origin. The letter was photographed and filed with the hundreds of other letters that had flooded Scotland Yard since the murders began. George Lusk gave his statement and was told the police would investigate thoroughly. He left the station feeling lighter without the physical burden of the package, but heavier with the knowledge of what it represented. News spread quickly. By evening, reporters had learned of the package. By the next morning, newspapers across London were printing accounts of the kidney sent to George Lusk, Bowes chairman of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee. Some papers reproduced the letter in full, misspellings and all. Others provided cleaned-up versions. All speculated wildly about its authenticity. Was this finally genuine proof from the Ripper himself? Or another elaborate hoax in a city drowning in false communications? Dr. Openshaw conducted his examination with scientific rigour. The organ was indeed a human kidney, he concluded. More specifically, it was a portion of her left kidney. It showed signs of Bright's disease, a chronic kidney ailment. It had been preserved in spirits, probably wine based on the smell. It had been removed from the body roughly 2 weeks earlier, consistent with the timing of Catherine Eddowes' murder. Most significantly, it had been removed from an adult woman. Catherine Eddowes' left kidney had been taken. The post-mortem examination had confirmed she suffered from Bright's disease. The timing matched. The gender matched. The medical evidence pointed toward a terrible conclusion. The kidney sent to George Lusk had come from the body of Catherine Eddowes, removed by her killer and mailed to the chairman of the Vigilance Committee as a grotesque trophy and proof of identity. Not everyone agreed. Other medical professionals examined the kidney and offered different opinions. One suggested it was too well preserved to have been kept for 2 weeks. Another thought the method of removal showed less skill than the post-mortem wounds on the victim suggested. The debate played out in medical journals and newspaper columns. But Dr. Openshaw, who examined it first and most thoroughly, remained convinced. This was Catherine Eddowes' kidney. This was real. The Ripper had written to George Lusk. George Lusk returned home to a house that felt different now, contaminated. The knowledge that a killer had written his name, had wrapped a piece of human flesh and sent it through the ordinary postal system to his door, changed everything. His family was frightened. His wife wanted to leave Whitechapel to go somewhere the Ripper's shadow did not reach. But where would they go? And how could he abandon the committee, the work, the people who depended on him? He tried to continue normally. He went to work, he attended meetings, he organised patrols, but he felt eyes on him constantly now. On the street, in the public house, at the market, people pointed and whispered, "That's George Lusk." He received the kidney. The Ripper sent it to him. Some looked at him with sympathy, others with morbid curiosity, a few with suspicion, as though receiving such a package implied guilt rather than victimhood. The letter became known as the From Hell letter, named for its opening words. It would become one of the most analysed documents in criminal history, pored over by handwriting experts and amateur detectives for decades. The kidney would be preserved, studied, and eventually lost to time, its final disposition unknown. But the impact on George Lusk was immediate and permanent. He had been chosen, marked, singled out from all the people in London as worthy of the Ripper's attention. He lay awake at night in his house on Alderney Road and wondered why. Why him? What had he done to earn this terrible distinction? Was it simply that the committee made him visible, or was there something more? Did the killer watch him, follow his movements, know his habits and routines? The thought made sleep impossible. Every creak of the house settling, every footstep on the street outside, every shadow cast by gaslight through the window could be the killer, come to deliver another message, or worse. October continued its cold descent toward November. The patrols walked, the police investigated, the newspapers printed their theories, and George Lusk, builder and chairman, carried the knowledge that somewhere in London, a man who had murdered at least 5 women had thought of him specifically, had taken the time to prepare a package, had written his name, and had sent him proof of evil that could be held in human hands. The box was gone. The kidney was at the hospital, the letter was with the police, but the memory remained, would always remain, the smell, the sight, the crude handwriting promising more horror to come. George Lusk had touched death, and death had touched him back. And that touch would never be washed away, not in all the years that remained to him, not even when the murders stopped and the killer vanished, and Whitechapel slowly returned to its ordinary grinding poverty. He would always be the man who received the kidney, the man Jack the Ripper chose, the man who opened a box one October morning and found hell inside. Chapter 5. The Medical Examination. The London Hospital stood on Whitechapel Road, a massive structure of brick and stone that served the poorest district in the city with a mixture of charity and scientific ambition. Its wards filled daily with victims of industrial accidents, infectious diseases, malnutrition, and violence. The doctors who worked there saw humanity at its most vulnerable, bodies broken by poverty and circumstance. They were men of science, trained to observe without emotion, to catalogue symptoms and pathologies with clinical detachment. But nothing in their training had prepared them for what arrived on October the 17th, 1888. Dr. Thomas Horrocks Openshaw was 30 years old, a rising figure in London medical circles. He served as curator of the Pathological Museum at the London Hospital, a position that required both scientific knowledge and administrative skill. His days were spent cataloguing specimens, preparing educational materials for medical students, and occasionally consulting on unusual cases that required specialised expertise. He was accustomed to examining human tissue. The museum contained hundreds of specimens preserved in jars, examples of disease and abnormality collected for educational purposes. But those specimens came from the dead through proper medical channels, donated or obtained through legal means, treated with the respect owed to human remains even in the service of science. The kidney that arrived at his laboratory came through different channels entirely. It had been sent through the post. It had been accompanied by a letter claiming authorship of the Whitechapel murders. It had been delivered to a private citizen as a taunt and a threat. The police brought it to Dr. Openshaw with a simple question. Was this organ human? And if so, could it have come from Catherine Eddowes? He prepared his workspace with methodical care, clean instruments, proper lighting, notes ready for recording observations, the kidney sat in its box, still partially wrapped in the tissue paper that had accompanied it, still smelling of the spirits used to preserve it. He unwrapped it completely and placed it on the examination table. The gas lamps burned bright around him. Outside, the hospital continued its work, nurses moving through corridors, patients crying out in pain or fever, the endless machinery of Victorian medicine grinding forward. But in this small laboratory, there was only silence and the object on the table. The kidney was approximately 3 inches in length. It represented roughly half of a complete organ, divided longitudinally. The cut was clean but not surgical, made with a sharp knife by someone who knew where to cut but lacked the precise technique of a trained surgeon. The tissue was dark red, the colour of old blood, preserved but beginning to show signs of deterioration. Dr. Openshaw examined the surface carefully, noting the texture, the condition of the remaining blood vessels, the way the tissue had been separated from its surrounding structures. He measured it. He weighed it. He examined it under magnification. The kidney showed clear signs of disease. The tissue was denser than healthy kidney tissue, slightly granular, the hallmarks of chronic Bright's disease. This was not an organ from a healthy person. The woman from whom this came had been suffering from kidney ailment for some time, probably years. The disease would have caused swelling, pain, difficulty with urination. She would have felt ill most days, though perhaps not ill enough to stop working, not ill enough to afford medical care in a district where poverty made illness a constant companion. The preservation was crude but effective. The kidney had been placed in spirits almost immediately after removal, probably wine or cheap alcohol. This had prevented rapid decay but not halted it entirely. Dr. Openshaw estimated the organ had been removed from the body approximately 2 weeks earlier, perhaps slightly more. The timing was consistent with Catherine Eddowes' murder on September 30th. The preservation was consistent with someone who had basic knowledge of how to keep organic tissue from immediate putrefaction, but lacked professional training. The most significant finding was the renal artery. The vessel that supplied blood to the kidney had been cut, not torn. The removal had been deliberate, done with a blade sharp enough to sever tissue cleanly. There was no evidence of sawing or repeated cuts, one stroke or perhaps two made by someone who knew generally where to cut, even if they lacked surgical precision. Dr. Openshaw had seen the post-mortem reports from the Ripper's victims. The wounds described there matched the method of removal evident in this specimen. Quick, efficient, done in darkness or near darkness, under time pressure, yet accomplished successfully. He compiled his observations into a formal report. The organ was human. It was a portion of a left kidney. It showed signs of Bright's disease. It had been removed from the body approximately 2 weeks prior. It came from an adult female. All of these facts were consistent with Catherine Eddowes, whose post-mortem examination had noted the removal of her left kidney and the presence of Bright's disease in the remaining right kidney. The probability that this organ came from her body was, in Dr. Openshaw's professional opinion, extremely high, but absolute certainty was impossible. Medical science in 1888 lacked the tools for definitive identification. There was no blood typing, no DNA analysis, no way to prove beyond any doubt that this specific piece of tissue came from that specific body. All Dr. Openshaw could provide was expert opinion based on observable evidence. The organ matched the victim in every measurable way. The timing was correct, the preservation method was consistent with someone who had immediate access to the body after death. The letter that accompanied it claimed authorship of the murder. The conclusion seemed inescapable, yet science demanded caution in its pronouncements. Other medical professionals were consulted. Dr. Frederick Gordon Brown, the police surgeon who had conducted Catherine Eddowes' post-mortem examination, examined the kidney and agreed with Dr. Openshaw's assessment. The organ was consistent with what had been removed from Eddowes' body. Dr. Henry Sutton, another respected physician, concurred, but dissenting voices emerged as well. Dr. Reed, another London hospital physician, expressed scepticism. The preservation seemed too good for tissue kept for 2 weeks. The method of removal seemed too crude for someone who had removed organs in situ from bodies in the dark. Perhaps this was a medical school specimen, stolen or purchased, sent by a hoaxer seeking notoriety. The debate played out in medical journals and professional correspondence. Dr. Openshaw defended his conclusions with careful reference to his observations, the disease state, the timing, the method of preservation, the consistency with known facts about Catherine Eddowes' body. But medicine was not mathematics. Professional disagreement was normal, even expected. Science advanced through debate and skepticism, yet somewhere beneath the professional discourse ran a current of discomfort, even fear. If the kidney was genuine, then the Ripper had reached beyond his usual pattern. He had not merely killed and fled. He had taken trophies. He had preserved them. He had sent them to the specific people with specific messages. This suggested planning, forethought, a level of organisation that made the crimes even more disturbing. Dr. Openshaw received his own correspondence after his involvement became public. Letters arrived at the hospital addressed to him, most from curious citizens seeking more information, some from fellow medical professionals offering opinions or asking questions. And then, on October 29th, he received a letter that made his blood slow in his veins. It was written in the same crude hand as the letter sent to George Lusk. It thanked him for his examination of the kidney. It promised he would hear from the writer again. It was signed simply Jack the Ripper. Now Dr. Openshaw understood what George Lusk had felt, opening that first package. The sensation of being watched, targeted, chosen, the knowledge that somewhere in London, a man who had killed multiple women knew his name, knew his work, knew where to send letters. The hospital increased security. The police were informed. Dr. Openshaw continued his duties but felt the weight of eyes he could not see, attention from a source he could not identify. The kidney itself remained at the London hospital for a time, preserved in a jar, examined by students and visiting physicians, a specimen like any other except for its terrible provenance. Eventually it would disappear, lost to time and the chaos of hospital record-keeping, its final disposition unknown. Some claimed it was buried. Others suggested it was eventually disposed of as medical waste. A few believed it remained somewhere in the hospital's collection, unlabeled and forgotten, sitting in a jar among hundreds of others. Its significance lost to everyone except historians who would search for it in vain more than a century later. But in October 1888, it was evidence. Proof perhaps that Jack the Ripper was real, and not merely a creation of newspaper sensationalism and public hysteria. Dr. Openshaw had held that proof in his hands, examined it with scientific instruments, and rendered his professional judgment. The kidney was human. The kidney came from Catherine Eddowes. The kidney was sent by her killer. These conclusions, carefully worded and scientifically supported, transformed the investigation. This was no longer merely a series of murders. This was something unprecedented, a killer who communicated, who preserved trophies, who selected specific people for his attention. The London hospital stood on Whitechapel Road and continued its work through autumn into winter. The sick arrived and were treated or died. The doctors made their rounds and wrote their reports. The medical students attended their lectures and examined their specimens. Life continued its ordinary course. But Dr. Openshaw, walking through the corridors where he had walked for years, felt the change. He had touched evil. He had examined its handiwork with scientific precision. And he had learned what George Lusk had learned, that some knowledge, once gained, could never be forgotten, that some specimens carried weight beyond their physical mass, that some autumn mornings in 1888 had changed everyone they touched, and the changes were permanent. The kidney sat in its jar, the reports were filed, the debate continued, and somewhere in London, a man who had written 2 letters and sent a piece of human flesh through the mail moved through crowds like any other person, invisible and ordinary, carrying his secrets and his terrible knowledge into a future that would never learn his name. Chapter 6. A man marked to George Lusk had lived 53 years in reasonable anonymity before October 1888. He was known in his neighbourhood certainly, recognised by fellow tradesmen and shopkeepers, respected for his work and his steady character, but he was not famous. His name did not appear in newspapers. Strangers did not point him out in the street. He moved through the world with the comfortable invisibility of an ordinary man living an ordinary life. The package changed everything. Within days of the kidney's arrival, his name appeared in newspapers across London and beyond. George Lusk, chairman of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee. George Lusk, recipient of communication from Jack the Ripper. George Lusk, the man who had opened a box and found horror inside. The newspapers printed his address. They described his business. They interviewed anyone who claimed knowledge of him. Reporters appeared at his door seeking statements, requesting interviews, asking how it felt to be chosen by the most notorious criminal in England. He tried to continue his work. His building contract still required attention. His clients still needed estimates and consultations, but concentration became impossible. Men he had known for years looked at him differently now, some with sympathy, treating him as a victim of circumstance deserving pity. Others with barely concealed excitement, eager to hear details about the package, the kidney, the letter. A few with suspicion, as though receiving such a communication implied involvement somehow, guilt by association with evil. The Vigilance Committee meetings became spectacles. Reporters attended uninvited. Curious citizens crowded into whatever room the committee secured for its gatherings. Every decision was scrutinized, every statement analyzed for hidden meaning. George Lusk had sought to organize his neighbors for mutual protection. He had become instead a public figure, thrust into prominence by circumstances he had not chosen and could not control. He spoke at meetings with dozens of eyes watching him, some sympathetic, some calculating, all wondering what it meant that the Ripper had written to him specifically. The letters continued, not from the killer, not again, but from others. Citizens offered advice, protection, theories about the murders. Some claimed psychic knowledge of the Ripper's identity and begged Lusk to investigate their visions. Others sent religious tracts explaining the murders as divine punishment for the sins of Whitechapel. A few were threatening, suggesting that Lusk had brought danger to the neighbourhood through his committee work, that he should cease his activities before more people were hurt. He read them all and filed them away, adding their weight to the growing burden of unwanted attention. His family suffered most. His wife lived with the knowledge that a murderer knew their address, had selected their home specifically for his grotesque message. She saw the way neighbours looked at their house now, pointing it out to visitors as the place where the kidney was sent. She felt the contamination of it, the sense that their home had been violated by evil's touch. Their children faced questions at school, cruel curiosity from other students who wanted details about the package, about what their father had seen and felt. The Lusk household became a tourist attraction in a district already drowning in morbid tourism. Whitechapel had filled with visitors since the murders began. People came from across London to walk the streets where the victims had died, to see the sites marked by violence, to feel the thrill of proximity to horror while remaining safely distant from actual danger. They photographed themselves at murder sites. They collected souvenirs, pebbles from Bucks Row, scraps of wall from Mitre Square. The more macabre purchased supposed relics from enterprising locals who sold everything from authentic Ripper knives to vials of victims' blood. The district became a grotesque exhibit. Its poverty and suffering transformed into entertainment for those who could return to comfortable homes when their curiosity was satisfied. George Lusk's house on Alderney Road became part of the tour. Groups paused outside, guides pointing out the building, recounting the story of the kidney. Some knocked on the door asking to see where the package had been opened. Others simply stared, as though the building itself might reveal something about the murders. Lusk had to install better locks, heavier curtains. He varied his route to work. He became cautious in ways that had never been necessary before October. The police maintained irregular surveillance of his home and movements. They believed reasonably that someone who had written to Lusk once might write again, might even escalate to physical contact. Detectives walked past his house at odd hours. Uniformed constables questioned his neighbours about suspicious visitors or unusual activity. The attention was meant to be protective, but it felt invasive, another layer of scrutiny added to an already examined life. George Lusk had become evidence himself, a living link to the killer, valuable not for who he was, but for what he represented. He tried to maintain the Vigilance Committee's work. The patrols continued through October and into November. Fewer volunteers appeared as the weather worsened and the initial fervour cooled. The committee had formed in crisis, sustained by fear and determination. But fear cannot remain at peak intensity indefinitely. The human mind acclimates even to horror. The nightly patrols became routine, then burden, then something many committee members found excuses to avoid. George Lusk walked his routes more often alone, lantern in hand, eyes searching shadows that no longer held the same immediate terror they had in September. The money ran out. Donations had arrived steadily after the committee's formation, citizens contributing what they could to support the patrols. But generosity has limits, especially in a district where poverty made every penny precious. The initial flood slowed to a trickle, then stopped. George Lusk spent his own money to keep lanterns burning and to provide small payments to volunteers who gave up paid work to walk the streets. His building business suffered. Time spent on committee work was time not spent earning. His savings diminished. His wife worried not just about the killer's attention, but about more prosaic concerns: rent, food, the basic costs of existence that did not pause for murder investigations. He wrote letters seeking additional funding. He appealed to politicians, to wealthy philanthropists, to anyone who might support the committee's work. Some responses were sympathetic but offered no money. Others suggested the committee had outlived its usefulness, that the police had the matter in hand, that citizens should return to their normal lives and let professionals handle the investigation. The implicit message was clear. George Lusk had become an inconvenience. His visibility an embarrassment to authorities who preferred their failures conducted without civilian commentary. November arrived cold and dark. The murders stopped. After Mary Jane Kelly was found butchered in her room on November the 9th, the Ripper fell silent. Days passed, then weeks, with no new victims. The patrols continued, but with decreasing frequency and commitment. Perhaps the killer had died or been imprisoned for other crimes. Perhaps he had left London. Perhaps he had simply finished whatever compulsion drove him. No one knew. The investigation continued, leads were followed, suspects questioned, but the trail grew colder with each passing day. George Lusk found himself in a strange position. He had been chosen by the killer, marked by his attention, yet he knew nothing more than anyone else. The package had contained no clues beyond its terrible contents. The letter had offered no insight into identity or motive. He was famous for receiving evidence he could not interpret, for being selected by a man who remained as invisible as ever. His brief prominence began to fade as the murders receded from immediate crisis to unsolved mystery. But the weight remained. He would always be the man who received the kidney. At gatherings, in public houses, on the street, people would recognize him and remember. Oh yes, George Lusk, the one who got that package. The marker followed him like a shadow. He could not return to the anonymity he had known before. The murders had written his name into their story permanently, and that story would be told and retold long after everyone involved was dead. He continued his building work through winter. The Vigilance Committee dissolved gradually, not with formal announcement, but through simple attrition. Men stopped attending meetings. Patrols were organised less frequently, then not at all. The crisis that had created the committee passed, or seemed to pass, and ordinary life reasserted itself. Whitechapel remained poor and dangerous, but no more so than before. The extraordinary terror of autumn 1888 faded into memory, still present but no longer immediate. George Lusk's health declined. The stress of those months, the sleepless nights, the constant scrutiny, the weight of unwanted prominence, all took their toll. He suffered from headaches and digestive troubles. His hands trembled occasionally, a tremor that had not been present before October. Doctors could find no specific ailment but recognized the general category: nervous exhaustion, the Victorian diagnosis for what happened when the mind and body were pushed beyond their limits and began to break down in subtle, cumulative ways. He remained in Whitechapel. He could not afford to move, and pride prevented abandoning the neighbourhood he had tried to protect. His business recovered slowly. His family adapted to their unwanted notoriety. Life continued because it had to, because bills needed paying and children needed feeding and work needed doing, regardless of what had happened in the autumn of 1888. But George Lusk never forgot. Every October for the rest of his life would carry the memory of that morning. Every package that arrived would be opened with hesitation. Every knock on the door would bring a moment of fear before rational thought reasserted itself. He had been marked, chosen, singled out from millions of London residents as worthy of Jack the Ripper's attention. He did not know why. He would never know why. And that not knowing would haunt him more than the memory of what he had seen in that small cardboard box. The absence of reason, the arbitrary nature of his selection, the sense that he had been caught in something vast and incomprehensible. These things disturb more deeply than simple fear ever could. George Lusk had touched mystery, and mystery had touched him back, and neither would ever let go completely. Chapter 7. The Suspects and Shadows. The investigation consumed Scotland Yard through autumn and into winter. Every detective who could be spared was assigned to the Whitechapel murders. Files multiplied. Witness statements filled cabinet after cabinet. Theories accumulated faster than they could be properly investigated. The pressure from politicians, press, and public was relentless. Solve the case, find the killer, restore order to the East End and confidence in British law enforcement. But the killer remained invisible, a phantom who struck and vanished, leaving only bodies and questions behind. The suspects emerged from fog as thick as the one that covered Whitechapel's streets. Some were brought forward by concerned citizens who had seen suspicious behaviour or remembered odd remarks. Others were generated by police investigation, names that have appeared in multiple witness statements or had some connections to the victims. A few became suspects through bad luck and coincidence. Wrong place and wrong time transformed into evidence of guilt by investigators desperate for progress. The list grew long, too long. Everyone and no one was the Ripper. Aaron Kosminski had come to England from Poland as a child. He was in his 20s in 1888, living in Whitechapel, working occasionally as a hairdresser. He suffered from what contemporary doctors called insanity, auditory hallucinations, paranoid delusions, an inability to care for himself properly. He ate from the gutters. He refused to wash. He heard voices that commanded and accused. In later years, police officials would name him as a prime suspect, citing witness testimony that was never properly documented and evidence that was never properly preserved. But in 1888, he was simply one more mentally ill man in a district that had many, noted by police but never arrested, watched but never charged. The specific evidence against him was thin. He lived in the area. He was Jewish, and some witnesses had described the man seen with victims as having a foreign or Jewish appearance. His mental illness made him seem capable of violence, though most people suffering from his particular afflictions turned their violence inward rather than outward. The police questioned him, they followed him, they interviewed people who knew him, but they found no physical evidence connecting him to any crime scene. No witness who could definitively identify him as being with any victim. No proof beyond the circumstantial fact of his presence in Whitechapel during the murders. Montague John Druitt presented a different profile entirely. He was educated, respectable, a barrister and teacher from a good family. But in December 1888, his body was pulled from the Thames, a suicide by drowning. His family believed he was going insane. His belongings suggested someone descending into mental instability. And the timing of his death, shortly after the last canonical murder, suggested to some investigators that the killing stopped because the killer had stopped himself. The theory gained traction years later when Melville Macnaghten, a senior Scotland Yard official named Druitt as the most likely suspect in a private memorandum. But the evidence was even weaker than against Kosminski. Druitt was a teacher with employment records showing he was working far from Whitechapel on several murder dates. He had no known connection to the victim or the district. The theory relied entirely on timing and the assumption that suicide implied guilt. It was the kind of conclusion reached by investigators who needed to close a case, who required someone to blame even without proof, who preferred a dead suspect who could neither confirm nor deny accusations. Michael Ostrog was a career criminal, a thief and con man with multiple arrests and imprisonments. He was Russian or Polish, depending on which record one believed. He used multiple aliases. He had been in and out of mental institutions. He fit the profile of a violent criminal, and the police had extensive files on his activities. But he had never been charged with violence against persons. His crimes were property offences, theft, fraud, deception, and crucially, he appeared to have been in prison in France during at least some of the murders. The records were unclear, contradictory, but the timeline did not support his presence in Whitechapel during autumn 1888. George Chapman, born Severin Klosowski, poisoned 3 women in later years and was hanged for murder in 1903. He had been living in Whitechapel during the Ripper murders, working as a barber's assistant. Inspector Frederick Aberline, who led the original Ripper investigation, would later say he believed Chapman was Jack the Ripper. But the method was entirely different. The Ripper used a knife and killed quickly, violently in public or semi-public spaces. Chapman used poison administered slowly over months in the privacy of domestic settings. Criminal psychology had not yet developed as a discipline, but even basic observations suggested these were different types of killers motivated by different impulses. Francis Tumblety was an American quack doctor with a hatred of women and a collection of preserved uteruses in jars. He was in London during the murders. He was arrested in November for gross indecency, homosexual offences under Victorian law, then fled to America before trial. Scotland Yard requested his extradition, suggesting they considered him a serious suspect. But he was never charged with any murder. The evidence was circumstantial. His presence in the city, his misogyny, his anatomical collection. Nothing connected him physically to any crime scene or victim. He lived out his life in America, occasionally surfacing in newspapers claiming knowledge of the Ripper's identity, but never providing evidence beyond his own suspicious proximity to events. James Maybrick was a cotton merchant from Liverpool. Decades after his death from arsenic poisoning, possibly suicide, possibly murder by his wife, a diary surfaced claiming to be his confession to the Ripper murders. The diary contained details about the crimes mixed with obvious errors and anachronisms. Handwriting analysis was inconclusive. Provenance was impossible to establish. Most serious researchers dismissed it as a modern forgery, but it generated enough interest and controversy to keep Maybrick's name in circulation as a suspect long after everyone directly involved in the case was dead. The Duke of Clarence, Prince Albert Victor, grandson of Queen Victoria and heir presumptive to the throne, was named as a suspect in the 1970s based on theories so elaborate and unsupported by evidence that they collapsed under basic scrutiny. The prince was not in London during several of the murders. He had alibis, staff, responsibilities that were documented. The theory required elaborate cover-ups involving the royal family, the government, and the Freemasons. It was the kind of speculation that said more about modern fascination with conspiracy than about Victorian reality. Women were suspected too. Jill the Ripper. Theories emerged periodically. A midwife who could move through Whitechapel unsuspected, who had anatomical knowledge, who might kill out of some twisted moral crusade against prostitution. Mary Piercy, who murdered her lover's wife and child in 1890, was suggested as possibly responsible for the Ripper murders as well. The theories never gained serious traction with investigators, but reflected a certain anxiety about female violence and the assumption that only a woman could move freely among the victims. The police investigated hundreds of people. They followed thousands of leads. They interviewed witnesses whose statements contradicted each other in every particular. The man seen with Mary Ann Nichols was described as tall, short, dark, light, foreign, English, Respectable, rough, every witness saw something different or remembered differently, or invented details to seem important. The investigation drowned in information that provided no clarity. Certain patterns emerged from the chaos. The killer likely lived or worked in Whitechapel. He knew the streets intimately, knew which alleys connected where, knew how to vanish into the maze of courts and passages. He killed quickly and efficiently, suggesting some anatomical knowledge, though not necessarily surgical training. Butchers, medical students, military surgeons, anyone experienced cutting flesh might possess sufficient skill. He took risks but calculated them well. He worked in near darkness, under time pressure, yet accomplished his mutilation successfully. He was strong enough to overcome adult women, fast enough to kill before they could scream effectively. Beyond these basic deductions, speculation took over. Was he a local man driven mad by poverty and drink? A gentleman from the West End seeking perverse entertainment? A religious fanatic punishing sin? A doctor experimenting on human subjects? A foreigner who would eventually return to his native country? Each theory had its adherents. Each explained some facts while ignoring others. Each said more about the theorist's prejudices than about the actual killer. The investigation fragmented. Metropolitan police and city police pursued different suspects with imperfect cooperation. Individual detectives developed pet theories and followed them obsessively. Resources were wasted checking impossible alibis and pursuing leads that existed only in the imagination of witnesses seeking attention. The case was too visible, too important, too politically charged for methodical investigation. Everyone wanted results immediately. Everyone had theories. No one had proof. The murders stopped. The investigation continued, but with decreasing intensity. Other crimes demanded attention. New cases arrived on detectives' desks. The Ripper files remained open, would officially remain open for years, but the active investigation wound down as winter turned to spring and spring to summer without further victims. The case became cold, then historical, then legendary. The suspects remained suspects. Their names passed down through police memos and unofficial recollections, none ever proven, all possible, any plausible. George Lusk watched the investigation from his peculiar position as both witness and victim. He knew no more than what he read in newspapers or heard from police officers who occasionally consulted with the Vigilance Committee. The package had made him briefly important to the investigation, but once the kidney was examined and his statement taken, he returned to irrelevance. He was not part of the professional apparatus searching for the killer. He was simply the man who had received a message, and the message had contained no useful information beyond its terrible proof that the killer was real. Somewhere in London, a man who had killed at least 5 women, perhaps more, the count depending on which murders one attributed to him, moved through crowds and lived his life. He might have been anyone: the barber cutting hair in a Whitechapel shop, the doctor treating patients at a free clinic, the dock worker loading ships at the Thames, the gentleman returning to his club in the West End, the soldier stationed at the Tower. Anyone, everyone, no one. The investigation had generated hundreds of suspects but identified none, and eventually, as the case receded from immediate concern into historical mystery, that failure would become permanent. Jack the Ripper would never be caught because Jack the Ripper had become a ghost, a name without a face, a legend built on unanswered questions and the terrible certainty that someone had walked among them and killed, and never been called to account. Chapter 8. The Silence. After November had arrived, with cold rain and lengthening darkness, the streets of Whitechapel grew slick with mud and refuse. The gas lamps burned longer each day as afternoon faded earlier into evening. The markets closed before full dark now, shopkeepers unwilling to keep their stalls open when fear still walked the district. Women who had no choice but to work the streets moved in groups when possible, their voices calling to each other through the fog, maintaining contact through sound when sight failed. The patrols continued, though with less fervour than in October. The Vigilance Committee's numbers had dwindled. Men who had volunteered in the first shock of crisis found reasons to return to their ordinary lives as the immediate terror dulled into chronic unease. Mary Jane Kelly was 25 years old. She was younger than the other victims, prettier according to those who knew her, less worn down by years of poverty and street life. She had come from Ireland or Wales, accounts varied, and had worked in a West End brothel before descending into the East End's cheaper accommodations. She lived in a single room at 13 Miller's Court, a narrow passage off Dorset Street. The room was small, barely large enough for a bed and a table, but it was hers. She paid rent when she could. She fell behind when she could not. On the night of November 8th, she owed 29 shillings, a debt that pressed on her like physical weight. She was seen throughout that evening, drinking at the Ten Bells public house, singing in the streets despite the rain, accompanied at various times by different men. Witnesses remembered her singing, "A violet I plucked from mother's grave when a boy." Her voice carried through the narrow courts, incongruously cheerful in a district that had learned to fear the dark. Sometime after midnight, she returned to her room in Miller's Court. A man was seen with her, descriptions varied as they always did. Dark coat or light, short or tall, young or middle-aged, the usual contradictions that made witness testimony nearly worthless. At 10:45 on the morning of November the 9th, Thomas Bowyer knocked on her door. He had been sent by the landlord to collect the overdue rent. No one answered. He tried the door and found it locked. Walking around to the side window, he reached through the broken pane, broken weeks earlier and never repaired, and pulled aside the makeshift curtain of an old coat that Mary Jane had hung for privacy. What he saw through that window would haunt him the rest of his life. The police arrived within minutes of Bowyer's frantic report. They broke down the door that had been locked from inside. The scene that greeted them was worse than anything they had encountered in the previous murders. Mary Jane Kelly lay on the bed, or what remained of her lay there. The killer had spent hours with her body. The mutilations were extensive, systematic, almost surgical in their thoroughness. Her throat was cut, her face was destroyed, rendered unrecognizable except by the colour of her hair and eyes. Her abdomen had been opened completely, the organs removed and arranged around the body. Her breasts had been cut off, her thighs had been stripped of flesh. The small room was thick with blood, the walls splattered, the floor pooled with it, the bed soaked entirely through. The photographer was summoned. The police surgeon made his examination. The body was eventually removed to the mortuary. The investigation began with the same questions that had been asked 4 times before. Who had been with her? What time had the murder occurred? Had anyone heard screams or sounds of struggle? The answers came slowly, contradictory, ultimately inconclusive. Someone thought they heard a cry of murder around 4 in the morning, but such cries were common in Whitechapel and usually ignored. Someone else claimed to have seen her alive at 8 in the morning, but the medical evidence suggested she had been dead for hours by then. The inquest was held quickly. The jury viewed the body and heard the medical testimony with visible distress. Dr. Thomas Bond, called in to examine Mary Jane Kelly and to review the previous murders, provided a detailed report on the mutilations and their implications. He noted the increase in savagery, the progression from relatively quick murders done in public spaces to this extended carnage in private. He suggested the killer had no anatomical training despite the organ removal, that the cuts were random rather than surgical, motivated by frenzy rather than knowledge. His conclusions contradicted earlier police surgeon reports, but reflected the chaos of the Kelly murder scene, where no clear Hebert method was evident beyond destruction itself. The newspapers covered the murder with the same intensity they had brought to the others, but beneath the headlines ran a current of exhaustion. How many times could the same story be told? How many variations on throat cut, abdomen opened, organs removed could be printed before readers grew numb to the horror? The coverage continued, but with a weary repetitiveness, as though even journalists hardened to sensationalism were reaching the limits of what could be profitably exploited. And then nothing happened. Days passed. A week. 2 weeks. November ended. December arrived with frost and early snow. The patrols walked their routes but encountered no new bodies. The police continued their investigation, but followed leads that went nowhere. The East End held its breath and waited for the next murder, but the next murder did not come. The silence stretched from days into weeks, from weeks into months. Winter passed. Spring arrived. The Ripper had vanished as completely as if he had never existed. The theories multiplied to explain the silence. Perhaps the killer had died. Disease, accident, suicide. Any of these might have ended his campaign without ever connecting his death to his crimes. Perhaps he had been arrested for some other offence and imprisoned, or committed to an asylum, his identity as the Ripper unknown even to authorities who held him. Perhaps he had left London, travelled to another city or country carrying his compulsion elsewhere. Perhaps the Kelly murder had satisfied whatever drove him, or perhaps it had horrified even him, shocking him into stopping. Perhaps he had simply decided to stop exercising the same control he had demonstrated in evading capture all those months. The police had no answers. The investigation remained officially open, but the intensity decreased as the other cases demanded attention. Detectives who had spent months pursuing the Ripper were reassigned. The files were moved to archives. The evidence was catalogued and stored. The case became historical even while most of the principals were still living. The unsolved murder of 5 women, or possibly more, depending on which victims one attributed to the same killer, joined the long list of crimes that Victorian law enforcement could not resolve. George Lusk felt the silence as relief mixed with frustration. Relief that no more women were dying, that the terror that had consumed Whitechapel was ebbing. Frustration that no answers had come, that the man who had sent him that package would never be identified, that the question of why he had been chosen would remain forever unanswered. The Vigilance Committee met less frequently as December progressed. The patrols ended entirely by year's end. The men who had given their time and energy to protecting their neighbourhood returned to their ordinary lives, the crisis having passed without resolution, but at least without continuation. The district began to heal in the way places heal from trauma, slowly, incompletely, scarred but functional. The murder sites became ordinary again. Bucks Row returned to being simply a street where people walked to work or home. Hanbury Street's backyard was cleaned and became just another yard behind another tenement. Mitre Square saw normal traffic. Miller's Court remained a place where poor people lived in small rooms, the memory of Mary Jane Kelly fading into the building's anonymous history. Life reasserted itself because it had no choice. The poor remained poor. The lodging houses filled each night. The markets opened each morning. Whitechapel continued its grinding existence, but the fear remained, dormant but present. Every autumn would carry echoes of that autumn. Every fog would be the fog that concealed him. Every shadow would potentially hide the man who had killed and vanished. The women who walked the streets after dark carried that knowledge with them. The residents who had lived through those months carried it too. Whitechapel had been marked by the murders, and the mark would not fade completely even as years passed and new generations arrived who knew the story only through accounts and legends. The newspapers moved on to other scandals and tragedies. The public's attention shifted to new horrors and entertainments. Jack the Ripper became yesterday's terror, still remembered but no longer immediate. The letters stopped arriving in such volume. The false confessions decreased. The theories continued, but in academic journals and true crime publications rather than daily newspapers. The case transformed from active crisis into historical mystery, the transition happening gradually through winter and spring, until by summer of 1889 the Ripper was past tense, something that had happened rather than something that was happening. The silence held. No more canonical victims appeared. Other murders occurred in Whitechapel, certainly. Violence was constant in the East End, but none bore the distinctive mutilations that marked the Ripper's work. None generated the same terror or received the same attention. The specific nightmare of autumn 1888 did not repeat itself. Whether that was because the killer was dead or imprisoned or simply finished, no one knew. The silence provided no answers, only the absence of further questions written in blood on cobblestones. George Lusk's life returned to a semblance of normalcy. His building business recovered as clients who had avoided him during his notoriety gradually returned. His family adapted to their unwanted fame, learning to deflect questions and ignore stares. The house on Alderney Road became just a house again, though George would always remember opening that package, would always feel the weight of what he had held in his hands. The memory did not fade. It simply moved from immediate present into permanent past, always there but no longer overwhelming. He read the newspaper accounts of the investigation slow winding down. He noted when detectives were reassigned, when the patrols ended, when the official interest moved elsewhere. He felt no satisfaction in any of it. The committee had tried. The police had tried. Everyone had tried, and no one had succeeded. The killer had won simply by stopping, by vanishing, by becoming impossible to distinguish from the millions of other men who lived in London and went about their business without drawing attention. The only victory available was the silence, the absence of new victims, and George Lusk accepted it as the incomplete resolution it was. Winter turned to spring, spring to summer. The city moved forward. The East End remained the East End, poor and dangerous and enduring, and somewhere, perhaps in London, perhaps elsewhere, perhaps no longer living, was a man who knew what no one else knew, who he was, why he had killed, why he had stopped. That knowledge was his alone, kept perfectly, never shared, taken with him into wherever he had gone. The silence that followed the Kelly murder was the last communication anyone would receive from Jack the Ripper, and that silence would remain unbroken forever. Chapter 9. The Weight of Memory. The years after 1888 moved forward with the relentless indifference of time. 1889 became 1890, 1890 became 1891, each year carrying George Lusk further from that October morning, but never entirely away from it. He continued his work as a builder, measuring timber and calculating costs, submitting estimates and completing contracts. The business sustained his family adequately, if not lavishly. His reputation, damaged temporarily by notoriety, rebuilt itself slowly as people forgot or stopped caring that he had once received a package from Jack the Ripper. But George Lusk never forgot. The package itself was gone. The kidney had disappeared into whatever fate awaited medical specimens when their evidentiary value expired. Destroyed, buried, lost in hospital storage, no one could say with certainty. The letter remained in police files at Scotland Yard, archived with hundreds of other letters that had flooded authorities during the investigation. George had no physical reminder of what he had received, but physical reminders were unnecessary. Memory provided detail more vivid than any artifact could have preserved. He remembered the weight of the box in his hands, the way the paper wrinkled when he unwrapped it, the smell that had reached him before he saw the contents, organic and wrong, preserved but decaying, the sight of the kidney lying in tissue paper, dark red and unmistakably human, the crude handwriting on the letter, barely literate, promising more horror with casual cruelty. These memories returned uninvited, triggered by unexpected stimuli, the smell of vinegar, the sight of a cardboard box, October's particular quality of light and air. He would be walking to a job site or sitting at dinner, and suddenly he was back in his parlour, opening that package again, feeling the shock and horror fresh as the moment it occurred. His family noticed the changes in him. His wife saw how he hesitated before opening mail, how he examined packages carefully before accepting them. His children observed his distraction, the way his attention would drift during conversations, his mind returning to that autumn, when their home had been invaded by evil's attention. He tried to be present, to focus on the immediate demands of family and work, but part of him remained in 1888, forever opening that box, forever discovering what was inside. The nightmares began months after the event and continued irregularly for years. He would dream of walking through Whitechapel's streets in fog so thick he could barely see his hand before his face. Footsteps would follow him, always just out of sight. He would turn and see nothing, but the footsteps continued. Sometimes he would find himself in Miller's Court, standing outside Mary Jane Kelly's room, knowing what lay inside but compelled to look. Sometimes he would be opening the package again, but instead of a kidney it contained his own organs, already removed, looking up at himself from the box. He would wake gasping, disoriented, his wife beside him asking what was wrong while he struggled to separate keys from memory from present reality. He spoke little about the experience. Friends and acquaintances knew the basic facts. Everyone in Whitechapel knew the basic facts. But George provided no elaboration. When asked about it, which happened less frequently as years passed, he would acknowledge receiving the package, confirm the newspapers had reported accurately, and change the subject. He saw no point in dwelling on it publicly. Privately, he had no choice. The memory dwelled on him regardless of his wishes. The investigation's failure haunted him particularly. He had been chosen by the killer, marked as worthy of communication, yet the communication had provided no useful information. The kidney proved the Ripper was real but offered no clue to his identity. The letter demonstrated his cruelty, but gave no insight into his motive or residence. George Lusk had been selected for a role in the century's most notorious murder mystery, but the role was purely passive, recipient, not participant. He'd contributed nothing to solving the case. He had simply been there, available, visible enough to attract the killer's attention, but helpless to prevent what had happened, or to ensure justice for what continued to go unpunished. He followed the investigation's slow fade from newspapers with a mixture of relief and disappointment. Relief that his name appeared less frequently, that his notoriety decreased as public attention moved elsewhere. Disappointment that no resolution came, that the killer was never caught, that the women who had died would never receive justice beyond the inadequate acknowledgement of their victimhood. The case transformed from active investigation into historical curiosity, and George Lusk transformed with it from witness to relic, a man whose significance derived entirely from what had happened to him, rather than anything he had done. Other murders occurred in Whitechapel through the 1890s. The district remained violent, poverty and desperation generating the same crimes they always had. But none bore the distinctive mutilations of the Ripper murders. None generated the same terror or attention. The specific nightmare of autumn 1888 remained unique, separate from the general violence that characterized the East End. George Lusk noted this with grim satisfaction. At least no more women had died that way. At least that particular horror had ended, even if it had ended without explanation or resolution. His health declined gradually through the 1890s. The doctors he consulted found no specific disease but noted general deterioration, weak digestion, poor sleep, persistent anxiety, the vague complaints they categorized as nervous exhaustion or neurasthenia. Victorian medicine had limited understanding of psychological trauma and even less ability to treat it. George was told to rest more, to avoid excitement, to perhaps take a holiday in the countryside where clean air and quiet might restore his constitution. He did none of these things. His business required his attention. His family needed his income. Rest was a luxury poverty did not permit. He aged faster than his years suggested he should. Photographs from the period, few survived, but some exist, show a man whose face carried more lines than 50-some years should have written, whose eyes looked tired even when he managed to smile for the camera. The weight he carried was invisible but evident in his posture, the slight stoop of his shoulders, the way he held himself as though expecting another blow from a direction he could not predict or defend against. The neighbourhood changed around him. Whitechapel in 1900 was different from Whitechapel in 1888, though poverty remained constant. Some buildings were torn down and rebuilt. Some streets were renamed. The population shifted as immigrants arrived from different countries, as old residents died or moved away, as the district's character transformed in the incremental way urban places transform over decades. But George Lusk remained on Alderney Road, living in the same house, working in the same trade, anchored to the place where he had received that package, and everything had changed. He became, in a sense, a guardian of memory. As years passed and the Ripper murders receded from immediate experience into history, George was one of the few people still living who had direct connection to the events. Occasionally a journalist would seek him out, requesting an interview for an anniversary article or a retrospective piece. He usually declined. Once or twice he agreed, and his words were recorded and printed, adding his testimony to the growing literature about the unsolved case. He spoke carefully in these interviews, sticking to facts, avoiding speculation, emphasizing that he knew no more than what had been publicly reported. He was a witness to his own experience, but not to the murders themselves. His knowledge was limited to the package and its contents. Everything else was second-hand, filtered through newspapers and police reports and rumour. The 20th century arrived. Queen Victoria died. King Edward VII ascended to the throne. The empire continued its vast machinery, wars fought in distant places, the poor remaining poor while the wealthy accumulated more. Whitechapel persisted in its grinding poverty, new generations born into the same circumstances their grandparents had endured. And George Lusk grew older, his connection to 1888 becoming more tenuous as memory faded, but never disappeared entirely. He died in 1919, 31 years after receiving the package. The cause was listed as heart failure, though in truth he had been failing gradually for years. His body worn down by work and worry and the accumulated weight of memory. His obituaries mentioned his role in the Ripper case. By 1919, that was what he was known for, not his building work or his family or anything else he had accomplished in 7 decades of life. George Lusk, chairman of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee. George Lusk, who received the From Hell letter and half a human kidney from Jack the Ripper. His life had been reduced to a single incident, his identity subsumed by events he had not chosen and could not escape. His family buried him in a cemetery east of the city. The funeral was modest, attended by relatives and a few old friends. No dignitaries came, no reporters covered it. He was not famous enough to warrant public mourning, only notorious enough that the newspapers noted his passing with brief mentions that he had been involved in the Ripper case decades earlier. His grave marker was simple, recording his name and dates, nothing about packages or kidneys or autumn 1888. His family wanted him remembered as a man, not as a footnote to unsolved murder. But history had other plans. In death as in life, George Lusk would be remembered primarily for what happened to him rather than who he was. Books about the Ripper would mention him. Documentaries would recount his story. Websites and true crime podcasts would analyze the package he received, debating its authenticity, speculating about its meaning, using his experience as evidence in their theories about the killer's identity. George Lusk had wanted to protect his neighbourhood. He had tried to organize ordinary men against extraordinary evil, and for his effort he had been chosen by that evil as worthy of attention, marked permanently by a single morning's horror, transformed from subject to object, from actor to acted upon. The weight he had carried was passed to history, which carried it easily. Memory of specific trauma fades quickly in the absence of personal connection. What had been immediate horror to George Lusk became historical curiosity to subsequent generations. The package became an artifact discussed in academic terms, analysed for what it revealed about the killer, rather than what it did to the recipient. The man who had opened that box and felt his world shift beneath him was forgotten except as a name in the story, a role rather than a person. But for George Lusk himself, through all those years between 1888 and 1919, the weight never decreased. He carried it every day, waking with it, sleeping with it when sleep came at all, moving through the world with the knowledge that evil had noticed him specifically, had selected him for its communication, had made him part of something he would never understand and could never escape. That was the weight of memory, Not the initial shock, which faded, but the permanent alteration of everything after. The sense that life divided into before and after, that the man who opened that package was different from the man who had existed before it arrived. And the difference was irreversible, permanent, a mark worn invisibly but constantly until death finally released him from carrying it. Chapter 10. The Echo Through Time. The story did not end with George Lusk's death. Stories like this never end. They echo forward through time, changing shape with each retelling, accumulating new layers of interpretation, while the original facts recede behind increasingly elaborate theories. The Whitechapel murders of autumn 1888 became Jack the Ripper, a name more famous than most monarchs, more enduring than most wars, transformed from tragedy into legend through the peculiar alchemy of unsolved mystery. The decades after the murders saw the first wave of Ripper literature. Retired police officers published their memoirs, each claiming special knowledge or inside information about the investigation. Detective Inspector Frederick Aberline, who had led the investigation on the ground, offered his opinions about suspects decades after the events. Sir Melville Macnaghten, who joined Scotland Yard after the murders ended, wrote a memorandum naming 3 prime suspects, Montague Druitt, Aaron Kosminski and Michael Ostrog, based on files he had reviewed rather than personal investigation. His memorandum was never meant for publication but eventually leaked, and the names he mentioned became permanently embedded in Ripper mythology, despite weak evidence against all 3. The 1920s and 1930s saw increased interest in true crime as a literary genre. The Ripper murders provided perfect material: unsolved mystery, dramatic violence, clear victims and an invisible villain, enough documented facts to seem historical, but enough gaps to permit creative speculation. Books appeared claiming to solve the case through new analysis of old evidence. Each confidently identified a different suspect. Each explained away contradictory evidence through elaborate theories. None provided proof that would have satisfied a court of law, but courts were not the audience. The readers wanted solutions, and authors provided them confidently and repeatedly. The 1960s brought the case into the modern true crime era. Television documentaries examined the evidence with then-current investigative techniques. Journalists researched the original files at Scotland Yard, discovering documents that had been filed and forgotten. The case became respectable subject matter for serious researchers while simultaneously becoming fodder for sensationalist exploitation. The Ripper existed in both academic journals and pulp magazines, analysed by historians and invented by hack writers in equal measure. The theory industry flourished. Royal conspiracy theories emerged, claiming the murders were committed to cover up an illegitimate pregnancy involving Prince Albert Victor. Masonic conspiracy theories suggested the mutilations contained hidden ritualistic meanings. American serial killer theories proposed that the Ripper fled to the United States and continued killing under different names. Medical establishment conspiracy theories claimed the killer was a prominent surgeon protected by his social class. Each theory found adherents who defended it passionately despite absence of proof. The Ripper became a Rorschach test onto which people projected their anxieties about class, gender, authority, and the capacity for evil in ordinary society. Ripperology emerged as a distinct field pursued by amateur enthusiasts and serious researchers alike. Conferences were held, journals were published, walking tours of murder sites became tourist attractions. Whitechapel, still poor, still struggling, found itself invaded regularly by groups seeking the locations where women had died violently over a century earlier. The district's poverty became picturesque when viewed through the lens of historical mystery. The suffering of real people transformed into entertainment for those who had never experienced similar desperation. New suspects were proposed regularly. DNA analysis, when it became available, was applied to letters and other potential evidence with inconclusive results. One analysis of a shawl supposedly belonging to Catherine Eddowes claimed to identify Aaron Kosminski definitively as the killer, but the methodology was questioned and the provenance of the shawl doubted. Another analysis of letters supposedly written by the Ripper attempted to identify the author through mitochondrial DNA, but could not definitively connect any letter to any specific individual. Science provided new tools for investigation, but could not overcome the fundamental problem. The killer had left no incontrovertible physical evidence, and the evidence that did exist had been handled, stored, and potentially contaminated for over a century. The From Hell letter and kidney became central exhibits in the ongoing investigation. Unlike the Dear Boss letter, which most researchers eventually dismissed as a journalist's hoax, the From Hell letter had stronger claim to authenticity. The kidney was real. The medical evidence suggested it came from Catherine Eddowes. The timing was right. The crude handwriting seemed genuine rather than affected. If any communication actually came from the killer, the package sent to George Lusk was the most likely candidate. This made George Lusk himself more important in retrospect than he had been during his lifetime. His testimony about receiving the package, his observations about its contents, his reaction, all became historical data analysed and reanalyzed by researchers seeking insight into the killer's psychology. But who George Lusk was as a person beyond that single incident remained largely unexplored. He was a role in the story, the recipient, not a fully realised human being with his own interior life, his own struggles and triumphs unrelated to the murders. Historical research focused on what happened to him, rather than who he was, reducing him to the function he served in the larger narrative. This was the fate of most peripheral figures in historical events. They were preserved only insofar as they intersected with what historians and readers cared about. Everything else about them dissolved into the anonymity of time. The victims received similar treatment, though occasional efforts were made to reclaim their humanity from the story's focus on their killer. Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly. They had lives before they were murdered, histories and personalities and relationships. They were not merely bodies found in the street or rooms. They were women who had survived poverty, who had loved and lost, who had endured lives of difficulty before encountering the violence that ended them. But the story that endured was not their story. It was the Ripper's story. They were supporting characters in a narrative about him, defined by their deaths rather than their lives. The question of why the case endured while thousands of other murders faded from memory had no single answer. The mystery certainly contributed. Unsolved cases naturally generate more speculation than solved ones. The violence was extreme, the mutilations shocking enough to capture attention, even in an era accustomed to brutality. The location mattered too. London in 1888 was the capital of the most powerful empire in the world, yet its East End was a place of medieval poverty and violence. The contrast between Victoria's prosperous empire and Whitechapel's desperate streets provided narrative tension, and the name itself, Jack the Ripper, was perfect, memorable, sinister, somehow playful and terrifying simultaneously. But perhaps the deepest reason for the case's persistence was what it represented. The Ripper was evil in pure form, stripped of explanation or context. He killed for no apparent reason. He took nothing valuable from his victims. He demonstrated no obvious motive beyond the violence itself. This made him incomprehensible. An incomprehensible evil is more frightening than evil that can be explained and categorized. If the Ripper had killed for money or revenge or jealousy, the crimes would have made sense within normal human psychology, however deranged. But his apparent lack of conventional motive made him seem alien, other, a force of chaos operating outside the rules that governed normal human behavior. The case became myth in the anthropological sense, a story told repeatedly to explain something fundamental about the human condition. It was a story about the limits of order and civilization, about how easily both could fail. Victorian society believed in progress, in the triumph of rationality and science over superstition and chaos. The Ripper demonstrated that progress is fragility. He operated in the heart of the Empire's capital and defied all efforts to identify or capture him. He proved that darkness persisted despite gas lamps, that evil existed despite moral certainty, that civilization was thinner than people wanted to believe. George Lusk's role in this myth was specific and limited. He represented the ordinary person confronted with incomprehensible evil. He had tried to do something, to organize resistance, to impose order on chaos, and for his effort, evil had noticed him, had sent him a message that confirmed both his powerlessness and the killer's continued freedom. The package delivered to Alderney Road was the moment when evil reached out of the shadows and touched someone directly, personally, by name. That touch marked George Lusk permanently and marked the story too, adding a dimension of direct communication that made the crimes more personal and therefore more frightening. The echo continued. New books appeared regularly, each promising to finally solve the case. Television shows revisited the evidence with modern techniques. Websites catalogued every detail and debated every theory. The murders remained unsolved more than a century after they occurred, and the lack of solution was itself part of the attraction. If the case was solved definitively, if the Ripper were identified beyond any doubt, some of the mystery's power would dissipate. The story worked because it remained open, because anyone could propose theories, because no authority could declare definitively what had happened and why. Whitechapel itself changed beyond recognition. The Victorian slums were demolished. Modern buildings rose where courts and alleys had been. The district gentrified in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Expensive apartments replacing tenements. Trendy restaurants opening where public houses had served the poor. But the murder sites were marked. Plaques and signs directed tourists to spots where women had died in 1888. The past was preserved, curated, made accessible to people who came seeking the thrill of proximity to historical horror while remaining safely distant from actual danger. The women who died in those locations were long forgotten as individuals. Their graves, when they could be found, were simple and neglected. No monuments commemorated their lives, but their deaths were remembered, analysed, discussed, transformed into entertainment and scholarly debate. This was history's cruelty. The dead existed only as facts in someone else's story, their significance determined entirely by how they intersected with the events others found interesting. The 5 canonical victims of Jack the Ripper would be remembered forever, but only as victims, only for how they died, never for who they were when living. And somewhere in all the theories and speculation and analysis, George Lusk persisted as a minor character. The man who received the kidney, the chairman who tried to organise against the terror. His name appeared in every comprehensive account of the case. His testimony was cited as evidence in debates about the From Hell letter's authenticity. But who he was, the builder from Alderney Road who had lived 53 years before that October morning and 31 years after, remained largely unexplored. He was preserved only in his role, only for what happened to him, only as the recipient of a package that connected him permanently to history's most famous unsolved mystery. The echo continued forward. It would continue as long as people were fascinated by crime and mystery, as long as the past held power to attract and disturb, as long as the name Jack the Ripper carried weight and recognition. The autumn of 1888 had ended more than a century ago. Everyone directly involved was dead. The city had transformed beyond anything they would recognise. But the story persisted, changing with each retelling but never disappearing, an echo that had become louder than the original sound, a legend that had outlived the reality it was based on, carrying forward into time indefinitely the memory of terror and violence, an unanswered question from a few dark months when evil walked Whitechapel streets and was never called to account. The candle burns low, the chamber falls silent, and history once again turns the page in the dark.